Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is fall, y'all, so let's paint some mushrooms. Everybody else is painting mushrooms, so I decided to jump on the bandwagon. Now this one is just a tiny bit more complicated than we normally do, but if you take it slow, step by step, you'll be able to manage it. I'm just going to show you all my little techniques here. And if we haven't met, I'm Viv. Welcome to Art with Viv, and let's just jump in and get started. As usual, I already have it sketched out. I also put some masking fluid on there, let it dry completely, and now I am just going to wet the top of this first mushroom. And as you see, I got a little snail peeking over on it. I'm dropping in some paint colors, some yellows, some reds, and letting those mix and mingle right there on the paper. Let that water do the work for you, people. Don't fuss with it. Don't fret over it. Drop you some clean water in, and then just start putting some paint in that clean water and letting it mix. Let those yellows and reds mix to some beautiful oranges. Now this is one of those fly agaric or gar, I don't even know how to say it. It's one of them mushrooms with the white dots on it. That's what we're gonna say. And so that's why I put masking fluid on it, to preserve those white dots, because I wasn't fixing to paint around all them white dots. So that masking fluid allows me to easily just paint right over and not worry about it. Now I am just taking a little bit of my brush and pulling some of that paint up so that it'll have some lighter sections. And we're going to do the same thing to these other little mushrooms. Wet it first, drop in some colors, let them mix and mingle, let the water do the work for you. After all, it is watercolor, and water is the boss. So I am letting that just mix right on the paper. I'm not doing a whole lot to it other than just dabbing that paint right onto the wetness. And where I think I have too much pigment, I am taking my brush, I'm dabbing it off on my paper towel so it is somewhat dry, and then picking up that paint. That's called lifting, if you don't know. So I'm lifting a little bit of that pigment where I think it's got a little bit too much, a little out of hand. There we go. I just lifted again. So now once we get those, we're going to let those kind of dry. I have mixed some purple in with that orangey red to make a neutral, almost pinky gray color, and that is going to be the shadow and the underneath of the mushrooms and the mushroom stems. Then I decided to go with some blue for these other little mushrooms. I don't know the name of them, so I don't know. They're just blue mushrooms. I just found a reference photo. I liked them, so I stuck them on here. Doing the same technique, wetting it with clean water first, and I've got some bluish purple, purple blue violet, whatever you want to call it, mixed up, and I'm just dropping that into the wetness where I want the mushroom to be a little bit darker. I'm adding a little bit more of the blue paint. I also introduced some turquoise into this grayed down purple just to give it a little bit of extra pizzazz, and so that it's just not so boring in all one color. So you will see me do that. I did that after I got those sort of purpley grays down while it was still wet, and I just dropped in that sort of it's a turquoise, like a teal color. I'm just dropping that in there and letting the water blend it however it goes. In some areas I'm adding a little bit more of that purple just to add sort of like a shadow, and then blending it out with my damp brush. So that's all there is to it. It's not a lot of complicated things. It's just wet on wet. We did that in our last tutorial with the fox. We did a lot of wet on wet. So that's all we're doing. Now we're going to let that dry a little bit. And after it dries, I'm going to come back in here and I am going to start to paint just tiny little lines. Again, I've mixed the orange and the purple together. This time with a little, well, it's not really an orange, it's a reddish orange. I've mixed more of the orange with the purple so that it goes more browny looking. It's a little more reddish brown looking. I'm just recycling the same colors that I have on my palette. I'm trying to keep it limited to those so that everything will be unified. I'm not trying to go out and get any crazy colors. I'm sticking with the basic colors that I started with, and that is basically red, yellow, blue, and I think that's it. Red, yellow, and blue is the colors that I have mixed here. Yeah. Now, if you want to know the exact colors of red, yellow, and blue, you could consider joining my Sweet Art Squad. Every week when I come out with these paintings, I always include inside that membership, it's only $5 a month, I include like a outline drawing, a complete supply list that says exactly what I used on this painting, along with some painting tips to tell you how I mix the colors and where I put the colors. So for $5 a month, you get 2 to 4 tutorials. You cannot beat that. That is a deal. But anyway, I'll link that below just in case you're interested. Now with this stem underneath, I wanted it to be a little bit darker up toward the top where the cap is casting a shadow. So all I did was I wet that down, and then I just dropped in some of that purple with a little bit of the orange mixed in, so it looks almost brownish looking, and I just let those mix together. I dropped the paint side by side and just let it mix together. Now I'm coming in with a darker red up here. I've wet that little corner, that little edge of the mushroom first with clean water, and then I'm just dropping in that deeper red color. That way it gives it some dimension, and it gives it, a little bit of shadow. We want it to look a little three-dimensional, even though this is more illustrative than it is hyper-real. It's not going to be hyper-realistic. So we are definitely going for more illustration, more cuteness, and more fun. Now, right along the edge, I'm putting in a little bit of that darker bluish purpley color, just as a shadow, and just darkening that up, adding a little bit more red to where I think it will be darker on the mushroom cap, around the snail some. So I am just starting the base for where I want that shadow to be cast by the snail. Just getting that going, adding a little bit more yellow in there just to warm it up even more. Make it look like it's sun-kissed. We like a sun-kissed mushroom around here. Yes, we do. We like it. All right, so we are just going right along, getting everything done. We are letting that blue dry. We are going to come back in, put a little bit more shadow work on these smaller mushrooms, just like we did the big mushroom. Wet it down first with some clean water, drop in some darker reds around the edges, and let that water sort of spread it out over that underlayer. Be a little careful. Don't rub too hard with your brush. Use a gentle touch so that you don't disturb that first layer of paint that you laid down, and it stays where it is, and it doesn't mix too much and make just like a mid-tone red. We want to make sure that we have some darker tones in there. So be really gentle. Make sure that first layer was dry before you add the clear water and the darker red, just so that you can keep it from all mingling together and ended up one shade instead of having darks and lights. Remember, it's the darks and the lights that make your painting exciting and pretty to look at. So now I am coming with a weak, really watery solution of that purple with just a touch more blue in it, so that it's leaning more toward the blue side than the purple side. And I'm just drawing the creases. There's these little tiny mushrooms, again, don't know what they're called. They have these little lines down from the top, sort of little, little indentions, little decorations, makes them look a little frilly. So I'm wanting to put in those lines, but I don't want them to be too dark at this point. And I always keep in mind that my watercolor will dry a lot lighter than it looks. These lines that I'm placing there now, they'll be very pale, but you'll be able to see them, but they'll be a lot paler once they dry. I'm also coming in with a little bit more of the pigment, the blue, and anywhere I want a shadow, I'm adding a little bit more of the purple while it's still wet. And let that dry. I'm just coming up here under my mushroom. I want this to be a little bit darker. There's not enough contrast between the light and the dark areas, so I'm just taking some of that sort of orangey brown and the purpley mix and just mixing it right onto that clean water I just put on there, and just making the shadow a little darker, then adding some texture going down the stem of the mushroom, adding a little bit more of a shadow. And now we're going to jump back over here to the other blue mushrooms and do the same thing that we just did on the other side, and that is put in these really fine lines, remembering that they will be lighter, not getting too stressed. You see I've switched to a smaller brush to do these, and even if you wanted to use a detail brush, you could also do that. My detail brush is not handy, so I'm just using this small number 2 brush. So I'm just going to get those lines. Again, I'm coming back in with some extra paint and pigment where I think there should be a little shadow, and just sort of dropping it on there. You see how I do that. We are not getting too fussy. We are not going to, this should be fun and relaxing, so we are not stressing. We just going to paint our little lines and be happy about it. That's all we're going to do. And you see they're fairly pale. Later on, you'll see we are going to come back and darken up some of those areas just to give it some definition. We're not going to darken the whole line from top to bottom. That would be too static and it really wouldn't look realistic. So you'll see what we do later on. So I'm just going to continue adding these, and then we're going to move on to our next little culprit, our next little victim, if you will. All right, now once you have all those little lines done, we're going to come back into that sort of grayish brown mix that we made and just darken up some shadows, add a little bit texture on the mushroom stem, also out on those little gills that the mushroom has underneath. We're going to add some of that to darken that up so that it looks like, you know, it's more shadowy under there next to the stem where that cap is really shadowing that area. And we're just going to add that dark color in there, just like so. Now I have put it directly onto dry paper, and then I'm just going to take my brush, dip it in some clean water, and blend that. There we go. Just blend, 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 blend. And just make sure that I get it a little bit darker. Now I have made sure that the first layer that we painted was completely dry before I did this. So you make sure yours is completely dry too if you give this a go. And I hope you do. It was a lot of fun to paint, but it took a lot longer than I thought it was going to. And it's okay. I'm really pleased with the actual results. Probably was a little more busy at the end than I planned, but you know, you live, you learn, and that's the whole object of the game, is just to paint, 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 and learn, 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 because every time you paint, you're going to learn something and you're going to get better. Now I'm coming back with a red so that I will go ahead and do like a shadow by the snail, and then I'm coming back with my blue and brown, and I am just going to shadow that other little stem of the mushroom. Now I'm going to start on some greenery. I've got a nice bright yellow green. I'm just doing the very base color to this little fern that's just now popping out of the ground. It's still all curled up. I think they call those fiddleheads. I'm not 100% sure, but I know that, you know, they look all curled up when they first pop out of the ground. Then I'm going to take that same color over to the big ferns, and I am just going to go down my outline, and I'm just doing tiny little brush strokes on either side of the lines that I've pre-drawn so that it looks like individual little leaflets, and it has that fern look to it. I didn't want to draw every little thing on the fern, so I just drew lines, and then I'm just doing little paintbrush strokes on either side, just little dots on each side, sort of little ovals on either side of the stroke so that it looks like leaves. And that's all we're going to do to make that look like a fern. To start off with, we're going to come back with some darker green though, and add some darker, maybe some sap green. I don't know, haven't decided yet, but we're going to come back in with some darker green to give it a little bit more dimension, because this is not a natural color for ferns. Ferns are not this bright yellow color, this sort of yellowish green color. So I'm just coming in while it's still wet and just touching my brush to different areas and letting the water spread that green and let the yellow green and that darker green mix together. Did that all the way down the line of the fern. Now I am just going to add some little gills, those little tiny lines underneath this mushroom cap, also adding a little dark shadow. Now I'm taking a little bit of a darker red and mixing it with some purple, some of that purple mix we got up there, and making some darker lines, some darker gills on this little mushroom so that they stand out a little better. Just remember, it looks really dark when I first put it on, but it is going to dry a lot lighter. That's just a feature of watercolor. It dries lighter than it looks when it's wet. So you always have to keep that in mind and try to adjust how you want it to look. Now I want to paint in the background, and I am using a really deep green here. And I am just painting right onto dry paper, and I'm kind of using some jiggity jaggedy brush strokes. I'm not doing really even brush strokes when I come down to the bottom. Now in the background, I'm trying to get that evenly covered back there, getting plenty of that dark green paint. But then I came back in and I dropped a little bit of clean water into it so it would make blooms and blossoms, so it would almost look like moss. So that's another thing that you can do. Just make sure you drop it in there while it's still wet, and you can see those little blooms and blossoms happening right between the two mushrooms. So that is a trick that I use to make it look more like moss. A lot of people don't like to create blooms, but I am intentionally trying to. And you see I am not painting it solid. I'm getting it darker green in some areas, more pressure on my brush in some areas, using a really light touch with the brush in other areas, so that it gives me a variation of really dark and really light green. Even though I'm just using the same exact color of green, it really depends on how much water and how hard you press your brush onto the paper, how light or dark it could be. So in that deep background, see, I'm dropping in some water there just so that I'll get those blooms. You see they're already starting, and it has a really nice mossy look. Now I'm taking some of that lighter yellow green and just doing a little foliage type stroke there. It's just really random strokes, sort of like your hand is jittery, like you've had too much coffee and your hand is just jittery and you're kind of skipping over that paper. That's what you want to do. Now I am continuing on, and while some of this is still wet, I'm dropping in some darker green into that lighter green just to give it some variation in color, and it just makes it look nice. So I'm going to let you watch this just for a second, and then I will return shortly. Now, once you get that darker background in, you paint the rest of your ferns the same exact way as you painted your first fern. While it's still wet, you come back and drop in some darker green on top of that sort of yellow green. Then we're going to work on this snail up here. This little snail, he's just kind of crawling over the top of this mushroom. We went directly onto dry paper with a nice yellow, a nice golden yellow. On his body, we are doing sort of a burnt sienna looking orangish brown, and just kind of coloring that. I added a little bit of that yellow to the brown so that he looks like the sun is kissing him too. While that shell is still wet, I'm coming with a deeper brown and just going where the shadow is, but making sure I'm pulling it out on the edges so that it looks almost like there's some ridges in his shell. Just going ahead and give the indication of that. And then where the shell goes around in that spiral, right where they overlap, I'm doing it with a deeper brown, like a burnt umber, I think it might be, I can't remember. But I wrote it down, and it will be, if you are a member of Sweet Art Squad, it will be in your packet, the correct color. So I'm also taking that darker brown and add some shadows where that shell is on top of the body, and then down his side, giving him a little contour there, giving him a nice shapely snail body. We want our snail to, be nice and shapely, so we're adding some shadows to give him some form. Also the shadows where his little shell is doing a spiral, we're getting those in there, and he is looking pretty good. Now that his little foot over there, it's not really a foot, it's part of his body, but it's kind of protruding over there. I put a little bit of a yellow on that. Now I'm just coming back with a darker brown. Now this is almost completely dry before I do this, because if you do this while it's wet, make these little tiny lines and texture on there, it'll just disappear if it's wet. So get it mostly dry. It can be just a tiny bit damp and it'd be okay, but try to remember to let it dry as much as you can before you do these little lines and textures, because the snail has this sort of rough looking texture, these little squares, almost like bricks, but irregular bricks on their skin. I guess that's called their skin. And that's all we want to sort of give an indication of. Coming back in here in some areas while those little lines are still wet, and just dropping in an even deeper brown so that it gives it some variation and it looks like his skin is rough like the snail. So, and I'm also trying to make it darker in some areas and lighter in other areas as I go. Like in some areas I'm adding a little bit more of that darker paint so that it looks more shadowed, and then like toward his head you see I've added less paint and a lot less of the darker brown so that his head and where his little antennas are, I don't know if those are antennas, but whatever, his eyes maybe, are a lot lighter. So while he dries, I'm going to come back, and this is still too light for me. Remember, you build up your dark values in watercolor. And like I said, they dry lighter, so that definitely dried a lot lighter than I wanted. So I'm just coming back with the same mixture we've been using, that purpley brownish mixture, and darkening that up, then taking a damp brush and blending that out. It's easy peasy. So now his shell has dried pretty much. It's very, very tiny bit damp, not really that damp at all, but enough to where the strokes are softening, but they're not bleeding out so much that they disappear. And I'm just adding some medium brown and then coming back where those shadows are and adding that deeper brown. But I am just making sort of little lines to imitate or to indicate the ridges on his shell and give it some texture. Also paying attention to where light and dark shadows are so that I can give it some form using lights and darks. Adding some more shadow on his body, darkening that up. Again, dries lighter than you think, so more than likely you'll have to come back and add another glaze or layer. Now I've decided that was too much of a line down here at the bottom, so I want to give it a little interest, so I'm just sort of splashing some greens around, leaving a little bit of the white of the paper shining through. I'm also wetting a little bit more of the background and dropping in some more greens so that it looks a little more blurry and soft, so that it doesn't stand out as much and it gives a nice contrast. Now I'm going in with a darker color, putting the shadow on the mushroom from the snail. He's got a nice little shadow going, but I decided it was a little too dark, so I came back later and added a little red over that. But those shadows start to define him, and you can separate him from the mushroom with those shadows. You can see that they don't blend as much together now because that shadow gives him a distinct edge. And I'm just darkening up some of the darker areas, and I'm actually using that purple mixture instead of the dark brown. Again, I'm just trying to keep everything unified and just keep recycling the same colors so that it is unified. Sometimes if you use colors that aren't going together, it gets kind of catty-wonky. We don't want a catty-wonky snail. We want a nice unified snail that looks like it belongs in the picture. Adding a little bit more of the darker colors up there and just sort of blending it out with the tip of my brush as I'm doing it. Adding that purple in some more shadow areas across the shell makes a really good shadow color. Since the shell is sort of a yellowy orange tone, purple makes a great shadow color for yellows and oranges. And this is looking really busy and I'm really liking it. I have also removed, I forgot to film that step, but I have also removed all of the masking fluid. And so I'm just coming in here in these little crevices, putting the shadows in. And I'm also going to put some shadows on those white marks on the mushrooms. Those marks actually protrude from the mushroom cap. They're not flat. They actually are like tissue that stick out from the mushroom, so they have a little bit of shadow. So I'm just using again my same purpley mixture, purpley blue, to make the shadows on those little round dots. And right away it gives them some dimension. You can see the difference between the ones that have shadows and the ones that don't. What a great contrast that is. And they automatically start looking more three-dimensional once you put that shadow on there. So that's the whole purpose of that. And we're just going to continue on putting in a little bit more of this purple into some areas where it needs a little bit more shadow on the whitest parts of the mushroom. And let's see, and I just cannot get satisfied with this shadow under the mushroom, so we are putting in another layer. And now I'm just going to come back with my fine detail brush. I found it, and so I'm just taking my golden maple detail brush in some of those lines that we put earlier on those little mushrooms. I'm just darkening them up, not the whole line, not all the lines, just some of the lines and just some of parts of the lines, especially where I know there's a shadow being cast. Then I make those lines plenty darker, and then I just darken up parts of the other lines that are sort of in the light area, and also darkening up those little stems, giving those some shadows. Just doing some of the detail work here, just making it a little bit more three-dimensional. You see, I'm not doing all the lines the whole way down. I am keeping the darker part in the shadows of the lines, and also adding a few little lines at the base just so it looks like there's some shadows. Then I decided to get out my Posca pen. Now this painting is completely dry right now. Don't put your Posca pen on a wet painting or you'll get a mess. So all I'm doing now is just adding some highlights with my white Posca pen. You could use gouache, you could use a jelly pen. I'm using my Posca pen because it seems to have the best coverage. It is a liquid acrylic, so this would qualify as a mixed media, adding just highlights where I think they need to be. And I like how that is coming out. My snail looks really good on my little mushroom there. Just adding some of those gills, some little white dots here and there where it have some really good highlights. Yeah, looks pretty good. And once you get all that finished, it'll be done. There's not much else to this. This took me an hour and a half, of real time. I've sped this up, but this took me about an hour and a half total. And that counts all the letting it dry in between time too. So there you go. I am just getting some little white highlights. Looking really pretty. I'm very pleased with this. I hope you give it a go. Please consider subscribing, hit that thumbs up button, share it with a friend that might like it. Any little thing helps. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my little version of the mushrooms that are going around YouTube, and I will see you soon. Thanks a lot for watching.